Welcome, everyone. My name is Alexandre Alaphilippe. We're just 1 minute ahead of timing for a webinar today at EU DisinfoLab. I see people are slowly coming in. Welcome. Today we're going to use Slido for Q&A and for asking questions to Guillaume to be able to react. So meanwhile that everybody starts to log in, we'll show you the first question of Slido. So please join us on slido.com. The code is disinfo, but you can also use the QR code here. There is a very nice blue overall because the sky is blue today in Brussels. So we are enjoying the fact that it's not raining. Where are you joining from today? We have 24 participants in the webinar. So we should have 24 answer into that question about where are you joining today? Brussels, Romania, Gothenburg. If I'm not mistaken, this is in Sweden. And if it's not, I just failed my geography publicly in front of every one of you. Helsinki, Milan. It's not, it's nice, but it's Nice in France. 27 participants. So join us at slido.com, #disinfo. Hello, friends from Bulgaria, from Quebec. Good morning, Quebec. Tallinn, etc. So I'm very happy to welcome you today while we are slowly starting all the presentations. So today our webinar, so as you know, EU DisinfoLab is having now weekly webinars, and we are trying to invite the different stakeholders that are doing excellent work into exposing disinformation, showing what it is, how it takes place. Today, we have decided to invite Guillaume Kuster from Check First. Maybe we can go back to the official presentation of the webinar. Guillaume Kuster is a CEO of Check First. Check First is a Finnish company. People who have followed our work at EU DisinfoLab have seen Check First collaboration in the project that we have run with Guillaume and with Guillaume's team called Crossover, which was the a dashboard of recommender system of many different platforms. And today we are very happy to have Guillaume joining us on a new webinar. So we have 1 hour basically fact-checking, and the media literacy NGO Faktabari and Check First have monitored Finland's social media and content platforms during the last presidential elections, which just took place a few weeks ago. The competition was expected to be tight, especially as the country's far-right party, the Finns, had scored an electoral success during last year's parliamentary election and was in a position to send their candidate to rare second one for the presidential race. So looking at social media in Finland, certainly reinforced this idea, as far-right partisans were disproportionately represented on some platforms when searching for information about the election. So Check First and Faktabari have simulated users across Finland to assess what was being shown to voters online. And in this case study, we're going to dive into campaign tactics, recommender system, algorithmic amplification, and data analysis. Guillaume, I welcome you on stage. Good afternoon, Guillaume. So we have around 30 minutes for your presentations, and I'm pretty sure we'll have a lot of time for questions. People, don't forget, if you want to ask questions, you can use slido.com #disinfo. Very important, we'll look only at the questions there, and you can already start asking questions before the end of the presentation. So we have a lot of questions already where we start. Guillaume, the floor is yours. Normally you should be able to share your screen.
Yeah, hello, good afternoon, and thank you very much, Alex and EU DisinfoLab for the opportunity to talk about our work together with Faktabari in Finland. So as you mentioned, we've been deploying antennas in Finland, if you will, to observe what recommender assistants were suggesting Finns on several different platforms. And today is going to be about what was to be found on YouTube during the presidential race campaign. As you mentioned, the presidential election took place for the second round last month on the 11th of February in Finland, and that's a rare event in such an election in Finland to have a second round, but it was the case this time. So the focus of the report that we just published this week is to see what recommendations were available to Finns on YouTube. I should disclose that work was rendered possible thanks to funding from the European Media and Information Fund, and who had selected our project, which is an extension of the crossover project you mentioned, Alex, for Finland, and that the project itself will be running until the end of the European election. So we would have been monitoring 2 elections in Finland in 2024 on several platforms and social media and search engines. So to frame the context of our work together with Faktabari, we set up a monitoring system ahead of the presidential election, which had an unusual number of candidates this time. Lots of people from civil society that wouldn't typically be part of the election. It was a very particular year to have an election for Finland, of course, as the country had been joining NATO, and as the tensions increased with the big neighbor on the east. So what I want to talk to you about today is, again, looking at YouTube and specifically what kind of information Finns were getting during the campaign on the platform. Just as to give you a little bit of context, about 2/3 of Finns are using the platform regularly. They do get, for a portion of them, the news from the platform, and there's a quote for previous research that was measuring this in the country. That is, and I believe we will share the link to the actual paper that we published this week in the chat. So the way we collected data, a word about methodology. So as you can see on the map, this is a map of Finland. We distributed an array of monitoring devices that were hosted by volunteers. We do not collect data from the volunteers themselves, but we use their internet connection to gain access from a variety of geographical positions in the country. That allows us to lower the chances to be detected by the platforms by having multiple measuring points, and also could give us some comparative data across geographies. One of the original questions we had, for instance, is if you look at the east part of Finland, it would be a legitimate question to ask yourself, do people living on the border with Russia get different recommendation from people living in the western side of the country? Which we found out that in the context of that election, it wasn't the case. So we monitored in total 8 platforms for the presidential election, including Google News, Google Search, DuckDuckGo, Bing, Instagram, TikTok, and others. There's going to be another report that will be published shortly about findings on these other platforms. So that's what the device looks like. It's a box. Again, no data collected from the volunteers themselves, but what we're doing is essentially adding a virtual family member to the household that will have its own usage of the platforms, mainly by searching terms that relates to the presidential election. So that could be keywords about the names of the candidates, obviously, but also the names of their parties, and topical themes that would have come up during the political debates during the campaign. So we ended up keeping 77 of these words, and that list was curated together with Faktabari. So to refresh your memories, and those who don't know them, Faktabari is about to celebrate its 10th anniversary next month. They are a major fact-checking and media literacy actor in Finland and on the European level. And we are really happy to be working with them. And also with the University of Helsinki, because the main author of the report is Alexandre from the university that Faktabari report to the team to analyze the data. So looking at the search results now and what you came for. So the first constatation we can make is that looking at all these 77 keywords, we have a rather wide variety of actors being presented in the search results. You can see that's a view of the top 10 most common channels, and it's quite representative of the type of content you would expect from the platform. Looking in detail, though, and here are a few isolated examples, and we're going to be looking at more generalized data afterwards. Let's say you were looking at the term presidential election in Finnish on YouTube. That view is a view from the public dashboard that we have put together that allows anyone to analyze the data or at least see the data that we have collected through our network of devices. And what you can see here on the left is for the time frame of 10 days preceding the second round of the presidential election, what would happen, which channels and videos would appear in the search results. So it's a kind of a summary, if you will, of having a team of 10 people, looking up stuff on YouTube all day long and logging what they're seeing. We just automate the process and show the results there. What you see in the teal color here, so roughly 2/3 of the pie chart, is an anonymous YouTube channel that is promoting heavily in a positive manner the far-right candidate. You see and that channel is called Fintopsu. It's not identified otherwise, but it's a channel that before the election was posting about video games and cars, and rather rarely. And all of a sudden, as the presidential race started, they posted, or he or she posted, very heavily favorable content about the far-right candidate, or some content not so favorable to other candidates, and especially the main opponents. So it's quite interesting because it was a risk that the Finns would get themselves in a situation analog to what France, for instance, had in the early 2000s with the Chirac-Le Pen second round. So having a far-right candidate for the first time of the history of the country being present at the second round of the presidential campaign, which did not in the end happen, but it was a risk that was very consciously described among the Finnish society before the election. So that's one example. You type in just a neutral term, presidential elections, in YouTube, and in the search results, you would have roughly 2/3 of the videos being presented to you as a user coming from a channel pushing far-right content. And on the right side of the screen, you see the top 5 search results per video, so that's not per channel. And again, you can see we've outlined in red 4 of these 5 top videos originate from the same Fintopsu channel, and even the 4th one features the far-right candidate. So that's a view of on the YouTube channel page itself. So you can see there's not a lot of information about who's operating the channel, but you can see from the content that it features the far-right perussuomalainen, true Finns in English, candidate quite heavily. Another quick example, that's another search term. This time it's presidential candidates, which is all one word in Finnish. It's a very efficient language. So it's, and again, in the list of keywords that we use, there's no qualificatives, there's no adjectives. We do not color the search. It's always very neutral terms. Could be, you know, east border, for instance, which has been quite topical in Finland with the closure of the east border with Russia, with the new government. You know, immigration would be such a term, but it's never qualified. It's always a neutral term that we put into the search box. And what you can see here is we do not have one channel, but two prominent channels being featured in the search results. So again, the teal color is in the same theme top. So, and then you have that large chunk here in purple, which is the official YouTube channel from the far right party in Finland. So looking at the recommendation results this time, so we had a sneak peek on some search results. What's interesting to us also is the snowball effect, because what we do collect as data is, let's say we input in the YouTube search box presidential candidates, we have a bunch of search results, but then you also have on the right screen, on the right side of the screen, recommendations and what is essentially your autoplay queue. And that can be subdivided further between first recommendations, which would be the video that plays automatically after the one you are watching, and then all subsequent ones. So the ordering kind of matters there. So looking this time, not at the search results, but at the recommendation results, we found two main findings. The first one is that there is a clear funneling effect towards a selection of very few channels. So what you can see here in that table is a list of the 10 most frequent channels that would appear in the recommendation and how often they would appear. So again, we screened 77 keywords, and you can see that if you just look at the 9 first ones, over 80% of the time they would be in the search results, regardless of the keyword that we were looking. So YouTube would still use us to a sub-selection of channels that is quite tight. And among these channels, I mean, there's very, you know, legitimate media organizations like YLE, which is the public service media in Finland. You would have the Finnish Defense Forces, but you also see FinTop, so that channel posting about, again, cars and video games before the presidential race, and all of a sudden became one of the better vectors of far-right campaigning on YouTube. Futurecast, which is a political podcast also, that you know, some questions can be raised about the way this podcast is operated. And so that's, you know, finding number one. There's a clear funneling effect, even if there are you know, many different channels. Even in a country with a rare language like Finland, there's more to YouTube channels in Finland that short list of 10. So just to illustrate that point further, what you can see here in that pie chart in red, you can see the proportion of the videos originating from these top 10 videos that do concentrate quite a lot of the results in terms of recommendations. And we also found that one single video featuring Jussi Halla-aho, so the far-right presidential candidate, represented in and of itself 4% of all recommendations on all 77 keywords, which, you know, 4% seems to be quite a small figure, but we've analyzed over 1.3 million different YouTube videos in the recommendations. And 4% of that is quite substantial in terms of recommendations. Another finding that we came across was the representation of different presidential candidates. So you can see here a list on the x-axis of the presidential candidates. and political personalities in Finland. And these bar charts is kind of presenting three different data sets. So, you know, on the left in the clearest or brightest green, you would have like the position of the candidate in the search results, and then in the recommendations, and in darker green as a first recommendation. And just to give you some sense of orientation on that graph, on the very leftmost part of the graph, we have the far right candidate Jussi Halla-aho, followed by Pekka Haavisto, who was the green candidate and what the left had to offer and was present at the second round. And then the current elected president of Finland, Alexander Stubb. So the three first ones were the ones that had the best chances to get elected. And as you can see, if you look at the darkest of all these bars, there's quite a difference in between Jussi Halla-aho and Pekka Haavisto, so far right and left, where Jussi Halla-aho is over 12% of the times as a first autoplay video, whereas the green/left candidate was under 2% of the time present as a first recommendation. It's a bit different for Alexander Stubb, who is just below 10%. So there's a steering towards right candidates that was observed across all 77 search words. And again, these search words, they do encompass all candidates and parties, plus topics that were relevant during the campaign. And all of the data, of course, is available in the methodology section of the paper that you'll be able to download. There's going to be a QR code at the end of the slide deck for you to have a deeper look if interested. So looking at some of the key learning points from that study and the work of Aleksi Knotila, we clearly see a funneling effect on a subset of a selection of channels. So whichever topic you're interested as a YouTube user in Finland, that loosely relates to the presidential election, you would have a fair amount of the same channels coming back in the search results. There's a lack of balance and visibilities across candidates. I mean, if I just go back to that slide here, and you look at some other candidates, you can see that some of the other people present in the election really got a low presence in the recommendations and even search results for that matter. So there's nothing, forcing you to have equal treatment for politicians during campaigns, but that might be a need in the future in electoral settings. So there's clearly a steering towards the right, the general right, if you will, or traditional right, and essentially far right politicians and discourse in the search results and recommendations. And there was in the last years, starting in 2019, some public statements made by YouTube about aiming to use borderline content and trying to achieve a goal to have 0.5% of the recommendations showcasing borderline content. Hope kind of depends how you qualify that, but what we saw on YouTube in that context wasn't really matching the intentions of YouTube and their guidelines. So we are formulating a few recommendations at the end of the report for platforms and regulators. The first one being for YouTube, and we would advise for a change in the logic of the recommendation system, where it seems that there was many studies about some assumptions about how the recommendation systems work, but the current state of what we have observed doesn't seem fit to serve well a society during an electoral campaign. You might be aware, I mean, probably the crowd here is aware about the DSA's risk assessments and risk mitigation measures that are provisioned by the Digital Services Act, so Article 34 and 35. We do recommend at least some partial publication or disclosure to identified external and independent experts of the risk assessments. We do acknowledge there's a risk for a platform to publish the risk assessments, because it could be a how to hack us, basically, a manual, but we think it would be a good idea to disclose at least part, because these documents are being kept secret for the moment, and we would probably benefit from learning about how the platforms themselves identify risks existing on their services and how they plan to mitigate these risks. One option is to wait for publication of the public version of the audits under Article 37 later this year. But as these risk assessments are due to occur regularly, would be wise, we think, at least to have some of the members of this community to have a look and to be able to make observations about the mitigation measures and maybe identify some risks that were not foreseen by the platforms themselves, and essentially helping the platform out. I mean, that's also one of our standing. We are not against the platforms. We are really happy to collaborate with them, and we had given the opportunity to YouTube, by the way, to comment on the findings. They chose not to. But we had shared our findings with them roughly 2 weeks before publication of the report. And then the last recommendation we formulated together with a fact about it is thinking about regulations to ensure fair and balanced electoral campaign online. Some countries, such as France, for instance, enforce rules about equal treatment of political candidates and all parties, depending on the election. In traditional media, giving a fair representation in terms of speech time, basically, on air. Why not try to think about something in the same realm for online platforms? Some other countries have electoral silence before the election. That doesn't exist online. So there's different tactics also from the parties. I mean, some candidates do prevent themselves from speaking because they could be found to not be compliant to that electoral silence if they publish in their name. But as we've described in Finland, it's not the Finnish far right themselves posting most of what YouTube picked up as recommendations. It was a sort of fan account anonymous accounts that relayed the discourse and the arguments of the candidate himself. And by the way, we've seen some similar tactics being used on TikTok with some accounts, also anonymous, posting similar content that what we found on YouTube. And again, that's going to be described in more detail in an upcoming report. So that's basically what we are, trying to learn and share about our findings on YouTube in the context of that election, which is really have a better look at the way the recommendation system works, especially in the context of electoral campaigns. I mean, it would be good in general, right? But that seems to be quite a pressing need, especially in 2024. As we all know, we would like to have a look at the risk assessments and be able to make comments. And it might be a good idea for parliaments to look into applying some fairness regulations ahead of elections, including on the platforms. So here's a summary slide that can allow you to download the full report using the QR code, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thanks a lot, Guillaume. really fascinating dive, and we already start to receive questions. As a reminder, we'll not look at the Q&A on Zoom, but we'll look at slido.com, and the hashtag is disinfo. And maybe Maria, our invisible but very precious hand, can start sharing back the slides with questions. Before we jump into this, Guillaume, I'm building on time. This project is the project that we started together in Belgium. What have you learned from the Belgium experience, and how this has helped you to build that project on the specific election monitoring?
So when we started the project together, we didn't really know what we were going to find. And it turns out that during the Belgian process of the project, we found quite a lot of foreign influence operations, or, for instance, seeing Chinese state-controlled media trying to spam Google News with an abundance of French language articles, right at the time where Amnesty International was publishing a report about the abuse of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, that kind of stuff. Also, the fact that CGTN superseded RT after the ban of RT and Sputnik on YouTube. And these first cases in Belgium gave us, a sense of the power of the tool and the monitoring that we were developing, because it showed us that we could uncover things that were more difficult to quantify otherwise. So, learning about the importance of doing systematic data collection, of having several measuring points across the country to validate your data, basically across different measuring points, and to see, also technically how reliable the monitoring can be, and to have it run and have problems and fix them and iterate. That was very valuable. Something that we've learned in between the two projects, I think, is in the way to present the data to partners and researchers. So let me backtrack a little bit. As I mentioned, we have public dashboards that anyone can consult. You just go to dashboard.crossover.social. And essentially, these dashboards are also used internally by the partnering entities. So, for instance, we were partners with EU DisinfoLab in Belgium, together with Apache, which is a Flemish language media outlet. So journalists of Apache were using the dashboards, but they were looking at daily data. So it was, it took quite some time and effort to go through the entire data set through the dashboards. So something we've done is we have simplified and summarized the potential leads for the researchers. Rather than having a day-by-day view, we would have the user, enable the user to select a time frame, like I showed you earlier, where we can look at the 10 days before the second round of the Finnish presidential election and have a mean view of the data, which saves a lot of time. And I mean, mostly, going into Finland. So Checkfirst is a Finnish company. We're based in Helsinki. We've seen during the parliamentary election last year, we've seen the raise of concern about the role of TikTok in the election. Just to give you some context, Finland is a coalition country where the political life is really based on consensus in between political formations, and is often 4 to 5 parties forming a coalition, which means then when we talk about parliamentary elections, there's a really tiny gap in terms of MP seats that determines the position of the party and its power, essentially. So in between number 1 and 3, we can be speaking about 3 MPs, members of parliament, in between. And during the parliamentary elections, TikTok was really pivotal for the far-right party. You had 3 candidates, mostly campaigning, if not exclusively, on TikTok, and these guys were coming out of nowhere and got elected. So that kind of really, started to worry civil society and politicians in Finland about the role of the platform. So that's why, long story short, we developed monitoring tools on TikTok and on Instagram, which we did not have during the Belgian project. So more monitoring, better monitoring to make the analytical work more efficient for the partners like Factabari.
Yeah, we'll come back a bit later on the purely technical issues, because I think there are many interesting questions. I think first, looking back at recommender system, I think there are many questions that are asked around like your hypothesis about the results that you've been seeing. So according to you, according to what you have seen and the work of your colleagues at Factabari, what was the cause of the dominance of far-right YouTube channels in not that much in the search as we have seen, because there was some kind of distribution, but like at least in the recommendation part. So do you think it's because of more posting, more like cross-platform work? Do you have any kind of interesting hypothesis behind this?
Yeah, I mean, I was about to use the same word. Anything I can mention here would be conjecture. We don't know. We don't know because algorithms are a black box until we have access to them, and hopefully the DSA will help us understand better how they work, at least in one point in time. So, there's lots of debates going on about Article 40 and data access for researchers, and then the audits being made, etc., etc. What we can
at a time where we learn today that, for instance, all the tools like Rectangle are going to shut down in a few months, and that the tool that will be accessible to replace this won't be open probably the same way than Rectangle was open.
So whichever the cause, we observe the effects on civil society. So what we are interested in is to see content as the users see it. So we have, of course, data points about how often different channels are posting. We can tell you, okay, what's the average length of the videos posted by channel X or Y, and do some comparative analysis to try to find, if not explanations, at least context or possible explanations for that. But first of all, I mean, like any project, and I think you know that quite closely, there's a question of limited resources. We would love for more research to be done, and we will be doing more research during the European elections, but there's a scope of the project, and it has unfortunately to stop at some point due to limited access to resources. But of course, there are ideas we can explore. But long story short, we don't have we couldn't have an explanation as to why our recommendations work the way they work. And even if YouTube did not answer to us directly, when Politico wanted to publish a piece about our reports, they oddly enough responded in a matter of 2 hours to Politico. But basically saying things like, well, we are looking at 80 billion data points, and the treatment of the recommendations in Finland is no different than anywhere else in the world. So it's not very helpful as a way to explain how the recommendation system work. But
it's not really a discussion. It's mostly a comment about their work and how hard it is, but that's the platform they are managing.
We think it's a very hard problem. We think it's a very hard problem. We're not saying that they are voluntarily showing far-right candidates to Finns during the presidential campaign, and that it's a form of an industrial accident, because effectively the algorithm is probably doing what it's asked to do, which is keeping people for as long as possible on the platform. But there are potentially side effects to that logic. So, I mean, if you're interested into cars or football, it might work marvelously for you. maybe in the case of politics, it's a more difficult problem to tackle. So, you know, we're not throwing stones at YouTube saying, you know, bad YouTube. We do realize it is a hard problem. What we try to do is give tangible observations about the state of recommendations to help them and regulators and the civil society at large to think more about the consequences of that. Something that was also not in the scope of that project is, you know, to measure the impact on actual, you know, people's political views, which is also a hard problem and something difficult to measure that wasn't in the scope of that project. But at least it's one more data point that allows us to ask ourselves more questions, and also on the regulator's side to see, okay, one example of that is everybody's kind of waiting for jurisprudence around the Article 34 and 35 of the DSA, because
what are Article 34 and 35, Guillaume, for the ones who are not
risk assessments
DSA experts?
Risk assessments, we mentioned it in the presentation, but it's like risk assessments when the platforms basically say, okay, that's potentially what could be problematic on a platform, how it could be used, you know, for nefarious ends. And Article 34 basically says, make a list of anything that can go wrong. And 35 says, make a list of everything you'll do to fix that. So these articles, they do define what are called systemic risks. There are like 4 categories of systemic risks that should be identified by the platforms. And one of them is, you know, the integrity of the electoral process. We don't know, and I think the Commission doesn't really know either, if what we have found is an example of that. We will have to wait for a court to look at that problem and to create jurisprudence on that. So, you know, it's since we've been talking about the DSA for a long time, and even lobbying before it was passed. I think at the time it was Article 17 to get rid of the media exemption that came back in the FA. But we've been saying for a long time, and probably will continue to say so, because it's such a huge piece of legislation that we are in a wait-and-see situation for the moment. A lot has happened since the DSA was first enforced. I mean, you know, the first staircase or you know, the first step for the DSA until last month, the extension to and the full enforcement of it. But something when a law is passed and enforced, there's still the possibility for it to be challenged before a court, and we understand that these risks were loosely written so that the piece of legislation would last for a long time and be valid, you know, not tied to specifically to today's problems, but would also work for future problems that we cannot really anticipate. So that's why we formulated these recommendations also. I mean, these risk assessments, they exist. They are secret documents. We think it would be helpful for the community of researchers and people working on the impact of these recommender systems to learn about the contents of that. And this is why we made such a recommendation in the report. I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Because I've been muting myself, Guillaume. I really like your summary of Article 34 and 35. List what could go wrong, list what you can do to avoid this wrong track to take. I think that's really policy explained for everybody without having to read very long laws and recitals, etc. And that's part of our mission at EU DisinfoLab to make this understandable for everybody. So thank you for your contribution. So I think you responded very clear. I'm just like, on the risks, there are, of course, the risk of misrepresentation, the risk of surrepresentation is there, but also because actually, as you said, in the recommender system, we don't know what are the criteria that could cause this kind of surrepresentation or underrepresentation of certain things. So the risk is clear, and they are clearer at the time that we don't know what are the I would say the invisible criteria, the invisible hand that can actually link to these results. A bit of we have many questions and thank you. We had many questions about like can trolls amplify artificial content? How many did you think that it's because they were posting more, etc.? So we dealt with this a bit with your response about like hypothesis, which was not what the project will look at, but basically I think this is these are valid questions, and it could affect results as much as it could not affect results. And maybe it's how they are seen, how viral they're getting, how maybe they have an internal score that can help them to help people to stay longer on the platform and to react more. So again, these are many hypotheses, and if there are many research questions being asked there, I think that's fantastic material for future research under the DSA or in general. So to go back a bit technically, and taking like a bit the devil's advocate, we have a devil's advocate into this webinar. So thank you to that person, because YouTube would object your results are scraped because you use fake profiles. So you would not be representative of real users' experience because it's like a research project and how people are not behaving like this. Of course, the results could be seen as flawed, etc. What would be your response to this?
It's a fair point, right? Until I explained that every scraping session that we do it with a fresh user. So there's no history attached to the profile. It's a non-logged in user. So I don't know if you ever tried this at home, which is open a new private window in your browser and go to YouTube so that YouTube doesn't know it's you. And look at the first page without typing anything on YouTube. And roughly, the algorithm will try to figure out who you are. Are you male or female? So that's why you would have, I'm really sorry, that's not me saying that. That's what we can find on YouTube. It's nail polish videos, boobs, and football and cars. And you can, you know, depending on the way you interact with the page, and you can teach YouTube about, you know, your stereotypical gender and interests as you continue to use the platform. We are interested into that YouTube trying to figure out portion of the equation, which is during the French presidential election, for instance, we had noticed that one of the many far-right candidates they were in France, Éric Zemmour, was present on that very basic non-logged-in search page. So meaning that as YouTube tries to figure out who you are, you would have some fringe content being there, not just, you know, people, cars, and football, but also politics. So there's an influence there, and in the techniques that YouTube are using to try to figure out what to suggest to you, and the same goes with the search results. So when you look for something neutral as presidential election without being logged in, YouTube tries its best to give you something, you know, that both fits the bill, answers your question, but also tries to figure out who you are. So one hypothetical question, I'm sorry, I'm also French, would be okay, does YouTube try to test out if you were willing to watch French content, and would that be, it's all conjecture at this point, right? But it's interesting to see if I type a neutral term as a non-logged in user, as a fresh baby user on YouTube, what do I see? And what is recommended to me once I click on one of the videos. So the entire research we did demonstrated that there was like almost 20% of far-right content present in all recommendations across all keywords, which, you know, at least permits us to ask the question to YouTube, why did it happen? And what's the purpose of that?
Thank you. And I think also what's interesting in the methodology that you designed is also that you also using residential IP addresses. So really people putting boxes at their homes, which is completely different of like creating a data server where you could actually, as a company, try to understand that it's maybe a commercial interest. So trying to be as close as you can be of a real user behavior to try to have these results.
True, and that ties into the previous questions also, because we had 10 measuring points across the country, and we roughly saw the same data set across all 10 locations. So that reinforces, you know, what we just said about that kind of discovery phase of YouTube, trying to figure out what you're interested in and hypothetically showing it into the search results and using that information for the subsequent searches and navigation. On the choice to have these devices or basically that code not run from a data center somewhere, but from actual individuals' homes. You know, I touched on that earlier, but there are several goals there. First, having multiple data measuring points, not just one. There's a lot of very valuable research projects. We are not at all undermining other people's work there, but where the code is run on the university server, or they rent a server in a data center somewhere, and usually that data center somewhere has also other customers, including the platforms. So it wouldn't, you know, it's not too far-fetched to imagine that, hey, we see a lot of requests from that same IP, which looks, you know, suspiciously close enough to ours. So what I'm getting at essentially is it's a mitigation measure so that we minimize the risk that the platforms are sending curated content to us. That is something that we've seen together, Alex, in the Crossover Belgium project, because we had noticed that in Belgium, the keyword Nazi was trending on Twitter at then the platform called Twitter. And at the time also, we had access to the API of Twitter. So researchers used a lot that API to figure out what was happening on Twitter. And if you were to listen to the API's results, you wouldn't see Nazi anywhere from the API. But if you were simulating users, as we did, you could see that it was trending quite a lot, actually, on the platform on specific days. So we had demonstrated that if, you know, researchers can have access to an API that is, you know, provided by a platform, it's not always to be trusted. So that's also something, you know, it's a mitigation measure from us to say, let's not take that risk of being served content. I'm not saying that they do it, but, you know, it's always better to be a bit more careful.
Thank you. Just we talked about stereotypes of profiles. Was there any kind of visibility that maybe affection of specific groups would have worked on this, on the content recommended by the profiles you mentioned?
Can you reformulate? I'm not sure I'm following.
Can I reformulate? Do you have, because of how you could profile some kind of requests and like playing on stereotypes of different profiles that are getting different type of information by the algorithms? Do you think that there is possibility that content would be more recommended to key target groups? So you watch a lot of football videos and you get served more recommendation from the far right, for instance.
Okay, so just to straighten the record, we did not do that. We did not create personas or create user profiles. What we did is use a fresh user with no search history each time. The goal is also to have something that is as close as possible to, you know, reality for new users, or that's another hypothesis. What happens when you express an interest to something new on YouTube that you have not trained the algorithm to, you know, be interested in? That could also fit into that, which is kind of that discovery mode of, okay, let's talk about something new. So It's certainly something that would be interesting to conduct, but we always come down to the same question of means, and we are ready to think about ways, because technically there are of course ways to do that. There are also some limitations of these kind of studies, because you would have to think hard about the kind of profiles that you would make up and why and how many. Am I going to design like a female teenager interested into K-pop? I have one, that's why I'm using that example. Um, and why that, and why not something else? I mean, how representative of the population are your personas? Because everybody's different in society. So I mean, that being said, yes, it would be super interesting work, but it would require, being associated with other researchers and have many brains to think about these questions, and figure out a methodology that could be solid and comprehensible for everyone.
Maybe a future project. About the profile that you found that was heavily recommended, like switching from gaming and cars to politics in elections.
Yeah.
Any hints about this reason of a shift? It's something that we saw in other investigations. One investigation that we did at the EU DisinfoLab, specifically around the war on Ukraine, where when big events happen, we see switches of YouTube channels.
It's an interesting question, and I mean, what we can say,
and just we're running a bit out of time, Guillaume, so I will ask you quite a short question.
You want me to be short? Okay. Basically, what we can say is there's a different set of tactics being used potentially by the far right, because a lot of the communication on social media by other parties were directly from the parties themselves, meaning their accounts. And we have observed on the far right side that both on TikTok and on YouTube, there were these channels, kind of partisan channels or fan clubs, if you will, that did post content. Then we have no way to say how close to the party do they actually belong to the party strategy, or do they do that out of the goodness of their hearts because they believe in the political cause. That's not something that can be easily measured, and certainly was not measured during the study. But it's interesting to see a difference in tactics, because we've seen some other successes. For instance, on Instagram, we've seen that the far left party, which is not typically the European far left in Finland, but it's okay. So it's a left country party that was quite popular on Instagram and successful, and more than other parties with productions and posts coming from the candidates themselves. So it's not all the same story everywhere, but there are different tactics that were employed, or one can consider that they were employed, but we couldn't establish a link in between the channel itself and the far right party in Finland, other than the type of content that was being pushed.
Quickly, also, in terms of like variety of profiles that were recommended, have you seen many legitimate established media outlets being recommended versus political actors versus other stuff?
Few. I mean, that comes back to that 10 most channels that find themselves at the other end of the funnel, and yes, there were some legitimate media organizations, Wiley being one, but oddly enough, it's not like the main channel. It's Wiley Mix, which is a department of the public service media that is looking at talking to a narrower portion of the population. But yeah, I mean, it wasn't all bad actors being presented into the funnel effect. I mean, you had a very popular YouTuber who does a great job of explaining the world in general and politics also in a neutral and balanced way. So it wasn't all a bad picture, but it was interesting to notice that whichever your interest was, you would see these 10 videos most of the time in your search results. in your recommendations. So it's clearly the illustration of the funneling effect that we could describe.
Thank you. Are the YouTube recommendations and far-right anonymous profiles likely to affect the EU elections in Finland in a similar way? And what about the rest of Europe? So we have elections ahead, Guillaume.
Yeah, 2024, right? So half of the planet voting and the EU elections ahead. It's certainly a very different typology of election. I have to admit we were a bit surprised not to see foreign meddling during the presidential election. That can be contextualized also because there's no pro-Russians in Finland. That's not something that exists really. Or if it does, it's a club with 12 people somewhere. So it's, not considering the local Russian minority or part of it, but among the political candidates, at least, no one was pro-Russian. Whereas in other European countries, it's not as clear. If there are links in between Russia and some political parties, even in big European countries. So looking at the European elections, there's going to be much more candidates there. And you're not voting for a person, you're voting mostly for a political ideology there. So we will be particularly attentive, but I mean, we are not looking for something particularly. We are, extending the net and seeing what we catch. We had some ideas about before the presidential election about maybe we'll find something about some foreign influence operations, and we did not. Fair enough. I mean, we just observe what's the reality of the recommendations and report on our findings. So it would be super interesting to have a project like that at the scale of the entire continent, and to be able to see for each of these elections, what's the role of these different platforms? Because again, I mean, we talk largely about YouTube today. We also monitor TikTok and Instagram and Google Search and others, Google News, Mastodon. So looking at these platforms and particularly people are lazy, right? So one of the use cases of social media is it's the end of the day, I just want to watch something. And that's the role of the recommender system. 70%, I mean, some research and even Google's own figures show that over 70% of the videos consumed on YouTube stem from recommendation. I don't know how you guys use YouTube. I have to admit that sometimes I cross on the sofa and I just watch whatever YouTube wants to show to me, because that's one of the function of the platform, entertainment. So the role of the recommender systems in shaping opinions and acting as a window on the world and your own country and interests is not negligible. So observing that and having more research and more data points about what effects does that have on citizens would be greatly beneficial. We're not in the world anymore where we had like 3 television channels and a bunch of newspapers and everybody saw the same facts and agreed on the facts. We have alternative views of society depending on what we see on the platforms, in part.
Yes. Thank you, Guillaume. One very good point that was maybe not said is like also Finnish is a very small language, so it also gives some capacities about and some insights about how like non-dominant languages in the world, in Europe, but also in the world, could be also impacted by these recommender systems directly.
So one thing that I can quickly mention, if I have 30 seconds.
Very quickly, Guillaume, because we are very late.
The Commission just closed the round of consultations on the election guidelines, and they do strongly suggest platforms to have local teams competent in local languages and being aware of the local context, especially during elections. We do support the idea, and we also have submitted an answer to these that call for comments.
Yeah, Thank you. For the next report, I can only encourage you to get in touch with Guillaume. The webinar will be in replay, and get in touch with Check First to be able to know more about the upcoming news that you might have. We can now thank you, Guillaume, for this very good presentation, and thank you for this, and good luck for everything that is going up with Check First, and say hi to the colleagues at Factabari, Miko, and all the team. Quickly, we have a few webinars coming in, so you will receive automatically an invitation to these webinars at the end, so tomorrow, actually. So with a small survey, please help us to rate this webinar so we can improve. We received a lot of interesting content. We're keeping receiving excellent content. We talked a lot about the DSA today. You want to know what are the so-called Digital Services Act coordinators. We'll have a fantastic session with Julian Jausch, animated by our colleague Joe McNamee next week. And to talk also about the DSA and access to data, 11 April, we'll have a fantastic other webinar led by Joe on data access and scrutiny with Silvia Merizo from the DG Connect and European Commission. So you will be able to hear what the DG Connect is expecting from the DSA to deliver. On online media, we'll have Global Media Registry joining us very soon on why do we need unique media identifier, which is a way to certify the provenance of media online, with Olaf Stenfat and Konrad Player-Simon. And to talk about FIMI and a case study, we'll have a presentation of Paperwall, where Chinese websites posing as local news outlets target global audiences with pro-Beijing content. And we'll be very happy to have Alberto Filtarelli from Citizen Lab with us, also an excellent webinar on FIMI and Chinese-originated disinformation. Thank you, Guillaume, again. You'll receive invitations for these webinars by your email tomorrow if you attended today, and if not, we will, of course, find all the links on our website, disinfo.eu, and our social media platforms, LinkedIn, Blue Sky, and Mastodon. Thank you, everybody, and have an excellent day ahead. Bye-bye.